Hello, I'm R J Dent and I'm in my library. The author I'm going to be looking at today is Michael Baldwin. Michael Baldwin, I first encountered his poetry. He's a poet, a novelist, a short story writer and an essayist. Was also a teacher. I first encountered him in this anthology, which is, as you can see, is Here Today, modern poems introduced by Ted Hughes. And there are 3 Michael Baldwin poems in here. Death on a Live Wire, which was the first one I ever read of his, which had a profound impact on me, an emotional impact. It was a very strong, powerful, a very interesting poem. There's also The Housewife in here, which is another interesting one, and one that a lot of people seem to show an interest in is called Social Study, which is about a woman with obviously some sort of mental difficulties, and she, well, I won't give away what the poem actually, what happens in the poem, but those 3 poems are in here, and that was my first encounter with Michael Baldwin. Now, Michael Baldwin also is an editor of poetry anthologies, and this here, as you can see, an anthology of tough verse, Billy the Kid, edited by Michael Baldwin. It hasn't got any of Michael Baldwin's poems in it. This is purely poems by other people, some very famous authors in here, Rudyard Kipling, Robert Lowry, Charles Causley, W.H. Davis, W.S. Gilbert, A. Houseman, Jonathan Swift, Ted Hughes, Roy Campbell, people like that, Robert Graves, Edgar Lee Masters. So it's an anthology, as it says there, quite rightly, of tough verse. Michael Baldwin also a writer of textbooks for classroom, for students of poetry. Now, one of the things Michael Baldwin did very well was to encourage other people to read and to write. And this book, Poetry Without Tears, first published in 1959, is a text for the classroom that shows, instructs students how to get the most from reading poetry. Very useful, very informative. Another non-fiction work that Michael Baldwin wrote was this one here. It's The Rivers and the Downs, Kent's Unsung Corner. And if you have a look at the map in here, you'll see that it's all focused around the Medway, which is where where Michael Baldwin grew up, the Isle of Grain, the Isle of Sheppey, around to Gravesend, which is where Pocahontas is buried. A very interesting book, very informative. This booklet was, as you can see, it was commissioned for the Kent Literature Festival in 1986, writing in Kent since 1900. And it's an overview of the Kent literary scene, going right back to far back in history, right up to what was then the present day. So an overview of the authors and the writing worth reading. Michael Baldwin also wrote books to help other writers with a way to write poetry. This is an early book, one of his books I read early on in my writing career, and I found it very, very useful. Very useful and very informative. And the same again with this one, which is The Way to Write Short Stories. Full of practical, sound advice, all very useful. Okay, now Michael Baldwin, as well as being a poet and a novelist, he also wrote a couple of autobiographical pieces. Granddad with Snails, it's an autobiography, but it's a sort of a fictionalised autobiography, very entertaining, very interesting, and I understand that it was adapted for the radio. That's the one he's perhaps most well known for, and this one is a sort of a sequel to it. That's Granddad with Snails was growing up as a child. This is when he's reached manhood and goes into the army. In Step with a Goat, very honest, very funny, and a bit grim in places. Michael Baldwin, also a short story writer, wrote 2 short story collections, Sebastian and Other Voices, which I have here, and the other one was Underneath and Other Situations, which I don't have yet. Okay, but his short stories are very disturbing and very entertaining. Don't know that those two things go together, but it seems to work. And then his poetry collections, Death on a Live Wire and On Stepping from a Six-Story Window. I bought this on the strength of having read Death on the Live Wire in that anthology here today that I showed you a few minutes ago. Some poems written by Michael Baldwin while he was living in France. Kinghorn. They use a landscape as the backdrop for some very, very strong and powerful poems. This one of my favourites, Buried God, it's selected poetry. So it has got Death on a Live Wire in it, I believe. Let me just have a look. I'm stepping from a six-story window. There's some very good ones in here. Dr. Death and King Rat. How Chazagit Lost His Way in a Creation Myth. Yeah, there are many taken from Michael Baldwin's poems, and it's a really good collection. Now we come on to Michael Baldwin's novels. So what we've got here is, I've put them in sort of chronological order. So we've got A World of Men, which is sort of 4 chaps working together, and one of them obviously sort of represents Michael Baldwin, and it's their story. This one, first person narrative, Mouthful of Gold, a first person narrative by somebody who's not actually very nice. If you think sort of like Bill Norton's Alfie, that kind of, or Pal Joey by John O'Hara, it's that kind of narrator, sort of an amoral narrator. This one, a novel about the Duke of Wellington, told from the point of view of his servant. Quite an entertaining read. Michael Baldwin there showing his knowledge of history, as he does in most of his novels. This one is a thriller, Exit Wounds. Now this one, it's set in England. If you think more of type of thriller that's like The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, that very low key but effective, or even The Living Daylights by chap who wrote James Bond, Ian Fleming. It's something like that kind of, the low key sort of spy thriller kind of stuff, where not a lot seems to happen, but of course a lot does. That's very, very good, as is this one as well. This is another thriller set in Israel. Very good, very entertaining. Going back to the historical novels, we've got The Rape of Ark here, which is set back in well, it's almost a Joan of Arc story, but not quite. Very entertaining, very interesting. This one, this is what some of the things Michael Baldwin does very well, is he tells us bits of history that would otherwise get overlooked. So this is the first Mrs. Wordsworth. This is Annette Wordsworth, not Dorothy. Yeah. So this is when Mrs. Wordsworth, the first Mrs. Wordsworth, it was about her story. We don't really get that, so we get told that story, so that's quite an interesting and entertaining one. And then finally we've got Dark Lady, which is a look at who Shakespeare's Dark Lady might actually have been. And those are the works I have by Michael Baldwin. I'm very proud to have these books in my library. But sadly, what I would say is recently, February the 3rd, 2014, Michael Baldwin died. Received notification of this from his GP, and I've had a bit of correspondence with his sons. And it's a terrible loss when a great writer, and Michael Baldwin was a great writer, when a great writer dies and a great teacher dies, it's a terrible loss for all of us, and I was upset by it. And you know, but the fact is, I'm doing this film, making this short film, to promote the works of Michael Baldwin.